There we go. As always, Anthony and myself and Sylvia are all set as co-hosts. So you can private message any of us. Remember, Sylvia is there for if you need help with translating from Chinese to English. So you just let us know. Any question is a good question. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Anthony, who is going to talk to us this morning about Crossfire.
Sorry, give me 1 second. I gotta get this PowerPoint started.
No, you're good. So I don't know where everybody is, but it is raining off and on here in Taipei as Tropical Storm Infa inches closer. Slowest moving tropical storm I've ever seen on a radar. Pretty sure at one point for 3 hours it didn't move anywhere. And yes, I sit and look at radars a lot because I'm from Kansas, where there are tornadoes. I'm used to tornadoes, not used to tropical storms. This will be a first.
Okay, sorry about that. Can everyone hear me okay? I know we had some internet issues yesterday, so hopefully we're doing all right. Okay, let me share my screen. All right, so the goal of this first session is to go over the mechanics of Crossfire in more detail. We're going to go over how to use Crossfire effectively, how to ask better questions during Crossfire, and how to make sure that your Crossfire answers are achieving what they need to. Over the last couple of sessions yesterday, many of you all had awesome questions about Crossfire, and hopefully we will answer some of those. And if at the end of the session you want to know more, or if, as usual, if during the session you come up with a question, feel free to interrupt me to ask whatever you would like. Yes, and as before, keep in mind that the reactions are there if you want to signal something to me, like slow down, or if you want to raise your hand. I'm keeping an eye on the chat and on the reactions so that we will see you if you do that. Okay, so this is a little bit of review from yesterday. So the structure of Crossfire is very basic. Like we said yesterday, it's 3 minutes long. There's a Crossfire period after the constructive, after the rebuttal, and after the summary. And the goal of Crossfire, or how Crossfire is different than a regular speech, is that it is a period for questions and answers rather than just talking. So instead of one person or one team just delivering their arguments, it's a conversation or a dialogue. A lot of what I say for the rest of this is advice that will be specific to Crossfire, and that unique quality of Crossfire comes from the fact that Crossfire is the only time in the debate when you get to interact with the other team directly. What I mean by that is, of course, you're interacting in terms of your arguments throughout the whole debate. You're responding to what the other side says, they're responding to you. But Crossfire is special because it's the only time when you get to have a conversation. And so that unique quality means that we can use Crossfire to accomplish some things that we can't really do during any other time in the debate. And if you have one philosophy or one idea for how to think about Crossfire and what to do with it, that would be my main guiding idea. It's you want to do things in the Crossfire that you cannot do in other parts of the debate as effectively. So I already talked about how it's different than cross-examination. So cross-examination has one person asking questions and one person answering, whereas Crossfire is different because of taking turns. And what that means for the debaters is that there is a slight difference in goals between a cross-examination and a crossfire. In a cross-examination, you can usually set up much more complicated ideas than in a crossfire. And the reason for this is that in cross-examination, there is a clear hierarchy. The questioner sets the topic, the questioner gets to ask about whatever they want, and if they don't like the answer they get, the questioner always has the ability to ask follow-up questions. So in a cross-examination, you can ask these long question chains. You can use basic questions to set up future questions, and you can ask leading questions that try to get your opponent to a specific place through this like multi-step process. Crossfire is different because of this turn-taking system. It's much more challenging to do those things that I was describing. So a lot of the things you are used to doing in cross-examination, much harder to do. When I was judging at the NTNU tournament in the spring, one of the most common things I noticed in cross-examination was that people would ask questions like, okay, so do you agree that something? And they would be hoping to get a specific answer, and then they're hoping to follow up that question with something else to try to reveal what their point is through a follow-up question or through even a third or a fourth question. Cross-examination is different. You don't really have the ability to do that because you're taking turns. So what is much more important in the crossfire structure is this idea of having a good flow for the interaction. So you want to make the judge feel comfortable with how the crossfire is going. You want the judge to like you. You want to show the judge that you are respectful and you're smart and you know what you're talking about and you're clever. And you also want to convey your ideas in as clear and concise of a way as you can, because you don't really have the ability to build your ideas over the course of multiple questions. And these ideas of control versus mutual respect are a good way to think about this. So with cross-examination, you have complete control, but with crossfire, you have to balance control against mutual respect. So by control, I mean setting the pace of the conversation, interrupting your opponent to ask your question, or interrupting your opponent's answer to make sure they don't ramble on, right? Like we mentioned yesterday, all of those might be tempting to do, but because of this importance of mutual respect and the norms for how a crossfire works, there has to be a balance between how much you try to control the crossfire versus how much you try to be respectful. Like I mentioned yesterday, crossfire can get really messy if people do not follow these norms and structures of taking turns and being respectful. So crossfires that go poorly can make a judge really frustrated. They can drive a judge absolutely crazy because people might be talking over each other. People might be, giving long answers to try to stop their opponents from asking a question, or people might just be making arguments and statements instead of asking their question quickly. So all of that stuff can make a judge really irritated. So it's really important not to do that, because given your inability to make these complex arguments, there's a higher reward for just showing that you're smart, polite, and know what's going on. So for every crossfire, there are obviously two parts. There are the questions and the answers. So that is how I want to break down what we can achieve and some strategies for how to do Crossfire better. So the first thing I'll talk about is asking questions. So there are four general goals, I would say, for what you can achieve in a Crossfire with asking questions. The most basic goal is clarification. So clarification is useful because you might be confused about something that happened during a speech. There might be an argument that you don't understand, or there might be a part of the speech that you just didn't hear from your opponent because your opponent might have been mumbling, or if we're still debating online next year, which hopefully we won't have to, your opponent might simply not have said it loudly enough, or maybe their internet went out and their connection was bad, right? There are many things that can happen that might require you to ask a clarification question. And you might think that this is a waste of time or that it's ineffective. And it's true that clarification questions are not the best use of Crossfire, right? If you understand everything and can spend your Crossfire attacking your opponent's claims and targeting the opponent's arguments so you can set up your responses, that's of course going to be better. But that doesn't mean you should feel like you should not ask a clarification question. If you don't understand what your opponent is saying, you're not going to be able to answer it during your speech. So spending some Crossfire time to figure out something you don't get can be very, very valuable. Another thing you can do is you can try to challenge the credibility of your opponent. And there are two ways you can do this. First, you can challenge the credibility of their source. So this is fundamentally an evidence issue, right? Your opponent might be citing a piece of evidence that is from an author who is not especially qualified. They could be citing a piece of evidence that uses faulty data, or they might be misinterpreting the evidence that they're citing, and the evidence does not actually support the argument your opponents are making. Those are some examples, and there are many other ways that evidence could be challenged or could be made less credible. But Crossfire is a great way to set that up. And it's one of the easiest questions you can ask because you can just sort of state the qualifications of the person and ask a simple question such as, why should we believe this person? Or you can ask, this study only uses a data set of 30 people. Why should we believe the conclusion you've drawn? Why can this conclusion be applied to everyone else who was not in the study? I believe when Shanna was talking about evidence during the Toolman model lecture yesterday, she gave an example about the debates about the English test requirement from last year. And a common study focused on just 200 students to try to draw a very broad conclusion about college students in Taiwan. So a good Crossfire question could ask about why it is acceptable to draw broad conclusions about students in Taiwan based on just 200 people. So that's the evidence-focused credibility challenge that you can achieve during Crossfire. Another is more subtle, and it targets not the evidence, but the opposing debaters themselves. This can be a little bit tricky, and it's very, very important to keep in mind as you try to do this main idea of being respectful to your opponents and the importance of not falling to using the personal attacks or ad hominem attacks as a replacement for arguments. So in order to undermine the credibility of our opponents, we want to be much more subtle. We can't just say, oh, you made this argument, so you must be a fool, right? That's obviously not acceptable. Instead, you want to ask questions that set your opponent up to make mistakes. So ask them background questions about their case. Ask them details about some of the evidence that they're citing. And they might not be able to tell you this information. And the more they stumble in response to questions like this, the more likely that the judge will trust you more and trust them less when you are making comparisons and arguments using your own authority or your own credibility. Questions about either of those things? Okay. A third purpose of questions that you can ask during Crossfire is undermining the logic of your opponent's arguments. So this is the most common type of direct argumentation that you can see in a Crossfire. And the reason is, unlike the constructive or the rebuttal, where debaters are supposed to introduce evidence and direct quotes from authors and studies to support their claims, typically in the Crossfire, we don't really do this. We don't introduce new evidence. We don't introduce new quotes or new studies during this speech. So it's pretty hard to make factual challenges during the Crossfire. This is something that's much easier to do during the speeches themselves. What we can do in the Crossfire is, if your opponent has said something inconsistent, or if your opponent has said something that is ridiculous on its face, something you can do in the Crossfire is you can use questions to instill doubt or have your judge start to think the way that you want them to think about that issue, instead of the way that your opponent wants you to think. And I have so in terms of how you can actually phrase these questions, my suggestions would be generally that the most effective phrasings of the questions are the ones where you start with a premise or a statement, and then you ask a question based on that premise. So, for example, let's say that your opponent is arguing that social media helps people organize protests, and that is good for democracy. A good way to ask a logic question about that would be to ask something like, first premise, there are many different ways that activists can organize protests, such as meeting up, using newsletters, making phone calls, having a website. Why is social media the only way that they can organize their protest activities? So you can see the part of the logic that I'm trying to attack, right? I'm trying to say, just because something's useful for activism or protest, that doesn't mean it's necessary. And other tools can accomplish the same benefit. So I have a premise, which is that I briefly stated or gestured at an argument, and then I asked a question that tries to get the opponent on record with their response. Good question in the chat. What is the difference between challenging the credibility of your opponents and undermining their logic? So hopefully the example I just gave of undermining their logic helped a little bit with this, but the way you should think about it is you can challenge the credibility of your opponent by just getting them to make any kind of mistake, right? So even if I don't challenge the credibility of the specific argument they're making, maybe I could ask a question such as, hey, so can you list what the demands of the sunflower movement were, for example? And my hope with a question like that would be that the opponents would be unable to give an answer. They would be unable to tell me what the demands of the sunflower movement were. And that would show the judge that maybe I know a little bit more about this issue than my opponent does. And then when we have arguments about the sunflower movement later, the hope is that the judge will trust me to talk about that issue more than they would trust the opponent. Whereas with undermining their logic, like with the example that I gave, the idea is a little bit different. The goal is to try to poke a hole in the actual argument that they're making, rather than try to make the opponents themselves seem less trustworthy. But of course, all of these goals are kind of connected. If I successfully poke a hole in my opponent's logic, that will also tend to challenge their credibility. So many of these goals work together, and there's some overlap for sure. But as concepts, those two goals are targeting slightly different things. Does that help? Awesome. Great question. Okay. The last category of goal that I would say matters a lot for the Crossfire is this idea of displaying your knowledge. So the displaying your knowledge idea or goal is the flip side of challenging your opponent's credibility. So just the same way you can undermine how much trust your opponent gets from the judge by revealing through questions that they don't know some important information about the topic, you can also increase your own credibility by asking really smart questions that dive deeply into examples or bring up new examples that have not been mentioned in the debate before, or just display a super, super strong grasp of the ideas or the history of the argument that you're discussing. All of those things will show the judge that you know what you're talking about, and you can make smart arguments, not just during your speech when you've written them out in advance, but also that you have really internalized and learned that information for yourself, so that in the free flowing format that is Crossfire, you're still able to command the issues and ask questions based on this information. So those are the main goals of questioning periods. Any questions about that? Okay. When we are challenged with a question, there are also some things that we want to achieve when we are answering. So one of the main things that we need to do is establish credibility. So if you remember from yesterday when we talked about flowing and line by line, we mentioned that Crossfire is not actually the same as a speech. We don't flow the Crossfire. The value of a Crossfire is that Crossfire can set up arguments that will be relevant in the future. They can preview and lay the groundwork for arguments we'll make during our speeches. What that means is that it's actually less important what exactly you say during the Crossfire. Instead, it's much more important that you demonstrate that you are credible, that you are confident, and that you can provide some defense of the arguments that you're making. Again, that defense does not have to be your best defense. What matters is that you're capable of mounting a defense and that you get your act together for the actual speech. Emily asks a good question, which is displaying your knowledge the same as revealing the argument in the Crossfire? So this is a good question. And this was a really, really big thing that people in the last session were curious about. Emily, your question is specific to the Crossfire, but this is also a question you could apply to any part of the debate. So whenever you are being clear, whenever you're explaining something very well, whenever you are being anything other than sneaky about your argument, aren't you giving away some information to your opponent that they could use against you? And the answer is yes, you are, but you should do it anyway. And the reason for this is exactly what Shanna alluded to earlier when she was elaborating on my point about clarification questions. If the other team is confused about something, it is likely that the judge is confused too. It is almost impossible to reliably confuse the opposing team while communicating clearly with the judge. And even if you could do that, it still wouldn't be a good idea, because once again, debate in general and Crossfire in particular really rests a lot on this idea of politeness and norms of how we talk to one another. So if you are very obviously hiding information and trying to be sneaky or shady about your argument to try to trick your opponent, instead of trying to beat them through the strength of the argument you're making, the judge will be able to tell, and the judge will be very annoyed with what you're doing. So yes, it reveals information, but you should want to reveal information, because the more you reveal, the clearer your argument will be to your judge. And even if your opponent benefits a little bit too, that should be okay, because you want to be relying on the strength of your argument to win, not relying on any kind of tricks or sneakiness. Does that make sense? Yeah. This is a really good question. And again, it's an important theme for everything that we do. There's often going to be small ticky-tacky advantages you can get by trying to be annoying and sneaky and shady, but the spirit in which we're arguing here is we're all friends, we're all trying to learn something. Of course, we're competing, but we're competing in a way that's friendly and hopefully educational. So in the spirit of that, we want to almost be cooperating with each other to make all of these crossfires and speeches work well. So that's kind of the general idea behind how to answer questions. And the specific goals of answering questions all flow from that. So again, priority one is to establish your credibility. If there's one thing or one skill that makes people better at answering crossfire questions, it is simply knowing your evidence and your arguments forwards and backwards. Know every detail about them. And of course, this is an impossible goal to do completely. Like, you are not going to be able to learn literally everything there is to know. But the more you know about your arguments, the easier it will be to answer your opponent's questions. And the way that you answer will make it super clear to your judge that you have a very high level of familiarity with your arguments. One thing that people ask me a lot about Crossfire is, well, I might not have memorized every fact. Is it okay if I look for an answer in my evidence during the Crossfire if I'm asked a question I don't know about? And while the answer is yes, it is okay to look for the answer to a question in your evidence. If you take longer, or if you pause really, really long before answering the question, it will seem like stalling, or like you lack understanding, or like you're taking a bunch of time to think because you don't know the answer. So being able to reference the response or reference information without having to refresh your memory is going to be better. Something to keep in mind in order to help you answer questions in a way that's credible is in the question structure I suggested earlier. So remember, giving a premise and then asking a question based on that premise. There's often a logic behind the question that you, as the person answering, don't necessarily have to agree with. So oftentimes these questions that have two hidden parts will be setting you up for a kind of trap. They will have these hidden assumptions built in, and if you accept these assumptions, these questions are designed to make it really difficult to give an answer that makes sense. So pay attention to the phrasing and the intention of the questioner. Think about what they are trying to gain from your answer to the question, and make sure that if there are assumptions that you don't agree with, you do not let them go unchallenged. You point those assumptions out, and you call out what is wrong with them, or what about them you disagree with. An important part of being credible also comes from how you sound while you're answering the question. So even if you don't know anything about the idea behind the question, even if you don't know what the correct answer is, it is almost always going to be better to sound confident and give your best guess. If you give your best guess and you make it sound like it is not a guess, that is almost always going to be better than saying nothing at all. If you are asked a fact-based question that you don't know the answer to, it can be okay to just say you don't know that detail, or you can look that up for your opponent and get back to them later. If you're asked some super, super detailed question about, like, oh, you mentioned this movement, what's the leader's name of this movement? If you don't know the leader's name, that's totally fine. You don't need to guess for that. You can just say, I don't remember this leader's name, but if that's important to you, I can look into that before the next Crossfire, and if you ask me again, I'll be able to tell you. It's totally fine to give an answer like that. But if they're attacking your logic and they make a good argument, and you don't know what the answer to that argument is, you should basically never agree with the argument your opponent is making. You should defend your logic. You should make your best guess as to a response. And as long as you sound really confident and sound like you know what you're talking about, that will get you through to a speech where hopefully by the time they make the argument in a speech, you've thought about it some more and you have a better answer. Sounding confident is really, really important. Okay. Related idea. I already mentioned this to some degree, but in your answers to Crossfire questions, you should really be trying to defend your logic. One of the main mistakes that people make when answering Crossfire questions is people tend to forget about all of the different resources they've already introduced and try to answer the question from scratch, right? But in most cases with Crossfire, or in all cases with Crossfire, you've already made arguments that you can rely on to answer these questions. So if someone asks you a question that is directly answered by a piece of evidence you had in your speech, there's no need to reinvent the wheel. There's no need to give an answer based on just your own knowledge. You can refer to your speech, and in fact, you should refer to your speech to give the answer to your question a little bit more of a strong foundation. Sometimes you won't be able to do this because the question will not directly relate to something you already said. In those cases, it is totally okay to introduce new logical answers to the premise of the question that are not based on a previous speech. But when you can lean on a previous speech to make the argument, you absolutely should. Does that make sense? Okay. Goal number 3 when you're answering questions is that you should be creative. Crossfires, once again, they're unique. They're the only period of direct interaction. And for the person answering questions, what that often means is you will not be able to predict 100% of what happens ahead of time. It's always going to be an element of unpredictability. It's two people having a conversation. So you don't know exactly what your opponent will ask you. So it's important to think on your feet. The best debaters are able to be flexible and adapt on the fly when crossfires don't go to plan. The best shortcut to doing this is that often from the way you are asked a question, you will be able to tell how your opponent is trying to spin something. Or maybe if you give a response and your opponent tries to pivot away from talking about something in your response, you can kind of tell what your opponent wants to get out of the exchange, what your opponent wants to focus on, and what your opponent does not want to focus on. And even if you don't super know what's going on, if you have a sense of what your opponent does and doesn't want to talk about from a competitive perspective, if you focus your answers on the terrain where your opponents are less comfortable, that will usually guide you in a helpful direction. And then the last big suggestion that I have for how to answer questions is to use examples as much as you can. Crossfire, once again, because of that difference from cross-examination, is all about making complicated ideas simple and easy to understand. And this is especially true because debates are very large. We're dealing with complicated ideas. There are lots of contentions. There are many arguments floating around throughout the different speeches. So it's hard to navigate how things interact, and the arguments themselves might be pretty complicated. So the more you can use examples to simplify and give an easy to understand illustration of your argument, the more it will benefit you and the more you will be able to clearly communicate your point. Questions about Crossfire answers? Okay, first question, can we answer questions by using evidence we didn't say before Crossfire? So what I would suggest for that is, so if you're asked a question about something that you didn't really talk about in your speech, and you have evidence that you would introduce in response to that argument, but you haven't introduced that evidence yet, I would say something like, if you make this argument during a speech, we will introduce a piece of evidence that responds directly. But for now, I can give you a preview of what that evidence says. And that evidence says, and then you can explain it. So maybe you have a study that illustrates the opposite of what their question says through some kind of poll. So then you can say, if you bring this up in a speech, we will introduce a poll that proves the opposite. It's a poll of around 1,000 people who were asked if they agree with this argument or if they agree with whatever, and those people said no, so that proves you're wrong or something. That's not a great study, but I'm just giving an example of how structurally that would work. In cross-examination, sometimes the cross-examiner interrupts the cross-examinee once they get what they want. Is that allowed in the Crossfire? So in a cross-examination, again, it's a little bit different because the cross-examiner asks all the questions. So part of the reason why it's usually a little bit more okay for the cross-examiner to jump in is because they get to control the flow. And if they want to ask a follow-up, they are free to do that. In Crossfire, it is a little bit less encouraged. So because you are not entitled to a follow-up, you don't really, there's not really a reason for you usually to jump in and stop the person answering questions from answering the question. But again, it's a balance. So it's a balance between control and between politeness. And if you feel like your opponent is going on and on, it's totally fine to super politely jump in and say something like, I think you've given me what I need. I want to save some time for questions later so you can ask your question now. Or I don't think you're answering my question. Would you mind if I asked a follow-up to clarify what I'm talking about? And then hopefully they'll say yes. So interrupting and just asking another question, not a great idea because it's a shared time. So we're really negotiating, or we're working together with the other team to divide up whose job it is to ask or answer at any given time. But if we can do it politely, we can do this. Yeah, Shanda's suggestion is great. If you say that answers my question, would you like to ask a question now? That's also perfectly fine. Yeah, anything that you know from cross-examination about how to control the flow of the conversation is probably applicable. You just need to put it through this filter to do it more politely and more diplomatically than you would have otherwise. Alexander asks, defend your logic to throw another idea that matches my argument or to show disagreement to my logic? No, so your opponent will be asking you a question that challenges your logic. And what I'm saying is you should always try to A, stand your ground. So you should never agree with your opponent's challenge to your logic. B, as much as you can, try to rely on evidence that you've already brought up to support the logic of your arguments. And C, if you don't have evidence that exists already, you can try to bring up some new argument if you can think of one, or some new logical justification to respond to the challenge your opponent is making. But always stand your ground is the main idea. You never want to concede the premise of your opponent's question. You don't want to agree with the challenge your opponent is making. I think we had a raised hand a second ago. Peggy, yeah.
Okay. Early on, you mentioned that if the opponent asks something and I have new evidence to answer the question, I can tell my opponent that you can bring it up in your speech. What do you mean by that?
So remember, the Crossfire is not kind of part of the line by line. It's in between the speeches. It's a conversation that happens and it's sort of separated. So a judge cannot vote based on something that happens in a Crossfire and is never brought up again, because the Crossfire is not part of the debate as in the same way that the speeches are. So for similar reasons, we usually say debaters should not bring up new evidence in the Crossfire, right? So because of those two things, if your opponent brings up some new argument that you would need evidence to respond to, you should not read that evidence during the crossfire. You should tell your opponent that if you bring that argument up in the speech, we will introduce evidence to respond, and then kind of give a preview of what that evidence would say. So an example of this is, let's say you have given your constructive speech and you have introduced your argument that social media helps activist movements succeed. It helps them kind of push their agenda and push their political movement. And your opponent asks you something like, well, how can it be true that activist movements use social media to organize if all social media does is become more polarizing and divide people's opinion from each other? You can be like, well, you have not proven yet that social media is divisive. If you make an argument and introduce a study to support this idea, we will challenge that. We have our own research that says social media does not increase divisiveness. It actually builds communities and helps people come together. And we have some evidence to support this. So if you bring this up in your speech, we will make an indictment of your evidence, and we will introduce evidence of our own to challenge that. Does that general idea make sense? Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
In cross-examination, a yes/no question often comes up to set the opponent up. Is it workable in a crossfire? Good question. And Shanna's answer is also good. So yeah, my general answer to that would be you should not really ask questions that only require a yes or a no. You should ask questions that force your opponent to say something a little bit more detailed or more complex about what their actual argument is. Again, if it's, the most common yes or no question that I've heard when judging NTNU debates is the question that sounds something like, did you say something, right? So did you say social media helps movements? Right? And then they will say, yes, we did say that. And then you will ask your question about that. That kind of question does not really help you, because that kind of question, you already know the answer to it. Everyone knows the answer to it, because if they were listening to the speech, they know that that is something that the opponent said, right? So if you want to ask a question about the argument that social media helps activists, you can just ask that question. You don't need to lay the groundwork, like you said, by just checking with them to make sure they did actually say it. All that checking with them does is it suggests to the judge that maybe you weren't paying attention, and so you maybe don't know if they said it, which is not great. We want to avoid that if we can, especially if you actually do know what your opponent is saying. Emily asks, in writing, we usually write examples to support your main idea. In Crossfire, what do examples mean? Can examples be evidence? Can a case study be examples? Yes to all of that. Examples is, what I mean by examples is just any specific application of a broader idea that you can describe. So for example, if someone asks you, why or how can you prove that social media increases divisiveness? If you give some examples of social media increasing divisiveness in Taiwan, like maybe how social media spread fake stories about how Vietnamese migrants brought coronavirus to Taiwan, or social media is used to make the division between people who support the Green Coalition or the Blue Coalition deeper, right? All of those are ways that you can give an application of your argument that clarify what you mean when you say social media increases divisiveness. And I mean, ironically, or I guess not ironically, as I'm answering your question, I'm giving this example because it helps to illustrate my point, which is exactly what I'm trying to, which is exactly what the point of examples in a crossfire is too. Yes, Shanna says common knowledge or personal examples can also be helpful. And that is absolutely true as well. Yeah, Charlotte makes a good point too. Part of the reason you would want you might want to tell your opponents to bring up a piece of evidence in a later speech instead of just answering it in the Crossfire right away is because you want to save time in the Crossfire because it's a shared resource. So the hope is that you can get your opponents to do that during the speech instead of wasting your Crossfire time. That's a good point. Really good questions, as always, with you all. You all are so good at this. Anyone else? Okay. I want to go over some things to avoid because Crossfire can be pretty tricky in terms of how it's structured. It's kind of unintuitive. So I want to go over some things that are really, really important to keep in mind as we're doing this so we don't make these common mistakes. And the first one I actually forgot to put on this slide, but it's really, really important. So I'm going to start with it. And that is when you are doing Crossfire, you want to make sure that you are looking at the judge. You do not want to look at your opponent. Whether you're asking or answering questions, you want to be looking at the judge. So this can feel really weird. And when you start doing it, it's going to seem strange. Like, I'm talking to the other team. Why am I looking at the judge instead of looking at the other team? The reason is you actually aren't talking to the other team. The appearance or the structure is kind of as if you were talking to the other team, but it doesn't really matter what the other team thinks. You're not trying to convince them. You don't really care how they react. You don't care if they really agree with you, right? Those things don't really tell you anything. You don't care if they're surprised by something you say. Doesn't really matter. All that's important is how the judge is reacting. So if you are trying to persuade someone, you want to be looking at them. You want to be making a connection with them. You want to be seeing how they are responding to the things you're saying. And looking at the judge instead of the other person helps you do all of that. Does that make sense? Or, I don't know, is that something that people have done in the past? So for those of you who have done debate, do people already look at the judge during cross-examination? Or is this new to people? Give me a yes, no. Do people look at the judge already? Paul looks at the judge. Nice. New. Okay. So some people have done this already. So if you're comfortable with this already, that's great. Other people, you have not done this before, and that's totally fine. So for those of you who are new to this, the reason I'm asking is I remember when I started doing this and people told me, and it was really, really unintuitive to me. Like I'm a pretty argumentative person. I like to argue. So if the other team disagrees with me about something, I really want to turn to them and be like, no, that's totally wrong. You know, here's all the reasons you're wrong. But resist that urge, because it's not about convincing the other team. It's not about what the other team says. It's about whether or not you can convince the judge that you're correct about what you're saying. So face the judge. Look at the judge all the time. Do not look at the other team. Other things to avoid. Open-ended questions. So open-ended questions are not great because they allow your opponent to just ramble and talk about whatever they want and to make extra explanations or new arguments. So we want to make when we ask a question, we want something specific to happen. Like, we want our opponents to give a specific response. And when you are asking a question that is not a clarification question, I would say the rule of thumb is you pretty much want to only ask questions where you have a pretty good idea of what your opponent will say in response. Or you have a pretty good idea of what the correct answer is that you want the judge to come away from your question thinking about. And the best way to do that is to ask your question as directly as possible. This is really helpful because, so I guess taking a step back, since all of this is all about trying to get information to the judge or make a point that a judge can understand, the difficult thing about Crossfire is that judges think about Crossfire differently. Some judges pay very close attention to the Crossfire and write down everything that is said, and they'll try to remember what was said so they can refer back to it later in the debate. Other judges will be struggling to pay attention. They won't care quite as much about the Crossfire. And so for all of these strategies, you want to be thinking about how each of these tactics helps both kinds of those judges take away more information or have a clear understanding of your argument. And so open-ended questions are bad for both of these kinds of judges. They're bad for judges who are paying close attention because they might want you to make your point very clearly so that they know what to write down. And with open-ended questions, they might not know what you're getting at. And if the judge is not paying close attention, it's even worse, because if you ask an open-ended question, your opponent starts rambling, a judge like that will just zone out and the question and answer will be completely pointless. So asking direct questions where you have a pretty good idea of what your opponent will say in response is generally the best approach. Charlotte asks, in policy debate, debaters like to maintain eye contact with their opponents. In this case, I'm suggesting they do not have eye contact with their opponent during Crossfire. Yes, that is correct. You should not be making eye contact with your opponent. You should be trying to make eye contact with your judge. And, I'm not saying literally never look at your opponent. If you give a glance to your opponent to see if they're ready or to see if they're almost done giving an answer, that's fine. Just most of the time, you should be looking at and making eye contact with the judge and not the opponent. Exactly. Other questions? Okay. Another thing to avoid, other than open-ended questions, is long-winded questions. And the reason for this mostly has to do with time and focus. If you recall, Crossfire, once again, is a shared resource. It's a shared period of time where both teams need a limited pool of time to get their points across. So it helps everyone if you make your questions short and to the point. Whereas if you make your questions long, everyone will become frustrated. Especially given our situation where debaters are often speaking a non-native second language. So probably most of you, English is not your first language, if not all of you. So given that, if you ask a really long question that is super confusing and you have a lot of detail and it's, you're wandering around, you have the super long sentence, it's guaranteed basically to be frustrating and confusing because people won't follow what you asked. You'll have to repeat your question and it's just a disaster. It gets the Crossfire off the rails super quickly. You also are likely to lose the judge, who might be struggling to follow along. So asking a short question is usually going to be better than asking a long question. And again, we're trying to appeal to these two types of judges. If the judge is paying super close attention, they might be following along, but they'll probably be annoyed. And if a judge is not paying close attention, they're almost definitely going to get lost because they're listening passively. So if you have a very complicated idea, they might not follow. Whereas if you simplify it, they probably will be able to follow. So avoid long-winded questions, ask questions that are short and direct. Another common mistake people make is focusing only on clarification. So earlier I mentioned one of the goals of Crossfire when asking questions is to get more information or get clarity about arguments that confused you earlier. And this is okay to do a little bit, but if you only do clarification in a Crossfire, you have really wasted what makes Crossfire special, which is the ability to get your opponent to respond to your questions immediately. And there's also some other downsides. If the judge knows what's going on, but you spend 3 minutes of Crossfire time just asking clarification questions, the judge might get bored. The judge might think that you were not paying attention, which could hurt your credibility. And if a judge is not paying attention, the clarification structure of Crossfire is inherently not interesting because all you're doing is asking, did you say this? Instead of doing what makes debate actually fun and challenging your opponent on stuff that they said. So a little bit of clarification can be good and necessary, but only clarification for an entire Crossfire is boring and should generally be avoided. Another important thing to avoid, and this is something I've emphasized throughout this conversation, is being rude. In public forum debate, the emphasis is on persuasion and trying to get the judge to agree with you. So what the judge thinks of you as a person is really important. If the judge doesn't like you, if the judge finds you annoying, if the judge thinks that you are impolite, this will hurt your standing with the judge. And no matter how objective or impartial or robotic the judge tries to be in deciding who won the debate, we're inevitably human, and those perceptions will affect how the judge reacts to what you're saying. So the last thing that it's important to avoid is breaking structure. This, I think, is the easiest mistake to make when learning about Crossfire for the first time, especially people who are transitioning away from cross-examination. It is very, very important to avoid getting into the trap of, oh, you have this great follow-up, so I'm just going to ask one more follow-up question, and then another and another. People moving from cross-examination to Crossfire, it's really easy for this to happen, and it derails the whole Crossfire because it might make it so only one person is asking stuff the whole time. People become confusing, and that is very, very difficult. So following the structure and taking turns and being super polite and going out of your way to make sure that everyone gets a chance to ask a question is all really important. It will get judges who are paying attention to support you because it makes the Crossfire run smoothly. And people who are not paying attention, it makes it even harder for them to follow along when the Crossfire just breaks apart and turns into a shambles. Charlotte asked a good question. What should debaters do when their opponent is talking too fast and as a result they fail to get the details of a lot of the evidence. So one thing is, judges, this is partly on you. So if you are judging a debate in which one team is clearly much more comfortable with English than the other, and they are going very fast and they're deliberately using complicated words to try to confuse people, I would usually say something when I'm judging, like, please slow down, or give some kind of visual cue, like maybe a hand gesture, or if you're on Zoom, using the slow down button, right? It's perfectly fine as a judge to do this. Students can do this too. It's totally fine to say speed or something out loud to try to get your opponents to slow down, as long as you're doing it, in good faith. People who just abuse this ability and say speed all the time to try to get your opponents to talk with a snail's pace, that's not a good look. But if you're actually lost because of how fast your opponent is going, asking them to slow down, saying speed during the speech, or asking them after the speech if they could speak slower in the future is a really good idea. So that's the first thing you can do. The second thing you can do is, if you are still lost. So this is also, Charlotte asks specifically what happens when you miss something or miss a lot of arguments because of speed. And there's a more general question, which is, what do you do when you miss a lot of arguments for any reason? Maybe you don't understand them, maybe you can't hear them. And there's a couple things you can do. One is, remember that in the Crossfire, you can ask your opponent to see their evidence. So if they cited a quote from an author, you can ask them to show you that quote. That way, you can read the underlying evidence at your own pace, and you don't have to follow along with the blazing speed that your opponents are presenting the evidence at. So that's thing number one. You can ask to see their evidence. Most people would also be fine if you even ask to see their whole speech. I think in English debates, if I am not mistaken, it's actually allowed to go during the speech, walk over to the other person and try to read their speech over their shoulder to try to follow along with some of the arguments that they're making. I believe that's something that's allowed. That's something that's okay to do in public forum debate as well. And then the last thing you can do is you can try to use teamwork to address this problem. So maybe you got some arguments and missed some others. Maybe your partner got some arguments and missed some others. And hopefully between the two of you, you can figure out more of what the opponent said by trying to combine what you heard and putting it together to learn more information. Question, do the judges get to decide if the rate of speech is too fast to be heard clearly? Yes, as the judge, it is largely up to you. And the way I would think about it is just, since this is an educational activity where we're trying to be fair to everyone and make sure everyone has a chance to compete, we want to be competing based on the quality of our arguments. So as debaters, you want to practice making your arguments at a fairly slow, easy to follow pace, which is easier to understand and more persuasive anyway. So it's a good idea to do that regardless. And as the judge, I would be very comfortable with saying to students, you should slow down. And I would not feel bad about doing this at all. If you've told students to slow down multiple times and they refuse to slow down, they're still going so fast that the other team can't respond. It is actually, I agree with Shana, it is totally okay to punish them for doing this, just because it's kind of against the spirit of what we're trying to do here, for one team to just be on purpose talking so fast that the other team can't even engage. Yes, judges can definitely, and I would actually broaden this to say anything that is happening in the debate where that's damaging to the structure of the round, whether that be someone being rude or someone making personal attacks or someone even making sexist comments or racist comments, anything like that, the judge can absolutely intervene, because at the end of the day, as a judge, you are the adult and teacher in the room. So anything you would feel comfortable with doing in a classroom to make sure your teachers feel comfortable with, you can do in a debate round as well, to make sure everyone can participate, the round is going fairly, and everyone feels safe and comfortable in their debate round. Is the evidence card required in a PF debate? Is there any standard format? We have a research session planned this afternoon to tell you about that. But yes, evidence cards are required, and there is a standard format. We will go over that later. Other questions? After asking for the evidence card from the opponent, when is a good time to read it? Great question. So 2 times you can read it. Actually, 3 times you can read it. So 1, and this is the theme for all of these, is remember, you're not alone. You have a team. So if you ask a question during the crossfire and your opponent gives you a piece of evidence, you can sit down and read it, and your partner can start asking and answering questions for you while you read the evidence, or vice versa. You can keep asking and answering, and your partner can read through the evidence that they've given you, that your opponent has given you. You can also use prep time to do this. So they give you evidence during the crossfire. You can think about the evidence and read through it during the prep time. And also remember, the speeches have a teamwork element too. So while one person is speaking, the other person can be reading through evidence during some of the speech, and then hopefully they will be able to jump in with an argument about that evidence when it becomes their time to talk. So yeah, anytime that you are not speaking, you should be flowing or prepping. Crossfire is very important, like I've gone over. So there are some things we can do to prepare for the crossfire to make sure that when we get to that point in the debate, we can give an effective set of crossfire speeches. So 3 times we can prepare for crossfires: before debates, during debates, and after debates. Before debates, we can prepare for crossfire in a very general sense. So think about common arguments. Prepare some questions about those common arguments. What arguments are you going to make? What are the responses your opponents are likely to bring up? Or what questions are your opponents likely to ask you? Think about answers to those objections and those questions. Remember that your teammates and your teachers, if you're a debater, are a resource. And practicing crossfire with your teachers and teammates can be a really good use of team meeting time. When I worked with schools that debated at the NTNU debates, this was one of the main things I would do with the students. I would have them present their contention, and then I would spend many minutes asking them a bunch of different questions about all the different parts to make sure that we have thought through what objections could come up and what answers we're going to make. It's a good idea to ask more than one person the same question too, so that different people on your team can contribute different thoughts. And when you actually have to present your answer during the debate, we have the best version of that answer ready to go. Practice can also help you with brainstorming new questions, because it will help you come up with new ideas. And if you write down what happens in your practice, you can use those ideas during your debates. And specifically, one thing I would practice is answering questions that you don't know the answer to. This is a skill that does not just happen on its own. You have to think about it actively, because it's not something that comes naturally. You have to be confident and you have to give an answer, even if you don't know if your answer is correct, right? That giving your best guess confidently idea that I was talking about earlier. So this is something that's important to practice. And there are some drills that you can do to practice this that Shanna will go over a little bit more when we break up and talk to the teachers. So that's what we can do before the debate. During the debate, crossfire preparation also needs to happen. A common mistake people make is they will stand up for crossfire and try to come up with questions on the spot. That is not a good idea. You should have a basic idea of what you want to talk about and what you want to ask before the speech starts. So as you listen to an opponent's constructive and you're flowing it, it's a good idea to also be jotting notes, jotting down ideas for questions. You could even do this on the flow itself. Maybe you wrote down an argument in the column, and then right underneath that argument in the same column, you can jot an idea for a question. Use your partner as a resource for this. Your partner can also give you some ideas. So make sure to talk to your partner about what you want to get out of the crossfire. Remember, the point of crossfires and the point of really all of the speeches is to build towards the final focus. The final focus is where you're going to make the final pitch for the debate. So crossfire has to respond to what is going on in the round. It cannot just be stuff you've written out before. You have to adjust it to what's going on and what are the strategic choices that you're making during the speeches to make sure that your questions are working together with your strategy. So only prepping before the debate, it's okay, but it's not the best. The best is you need to adjust the questions you've prepped to fit your strategy during the debate itself. And then the last time to practice cross-X or crossfire is after the debate. So you might think that after the debate, what happened happened and you're done. But after the debate is one of the best times when you can improve on what you've done. Try to remember questions that you struggle with and make sure that you consult with your teachers and coaches about how to make your answers to those questions better. If your opponents made an argument or asked something you didn't know about, spend some time after the debate thinking about how you want to answer that question in the future. You can give redos on those answers. So practice literally saying them out loud because you want them to sound natural. You want to know them, you want to remember them, and you want them to sound like you're not just reading them off of a piece of paper. You want them to sound natural so that they help you build that credibility that's so important. And also remember that in many of these cases, you'll have time after the debate to talk to your judge and ask them what they thought of what happened in the round. So if there's some argument or there's some question where you don't know what the best way to answer it is, you can ask the judge, hey, so they asked me this question, I wasn't really sure how to answer it, how would you suggest I do it? And then your judge, who saw the debate and knows what you're talking about, can give you some suggestions for how to answer it better. So preparing for the crossfire is something you can do before, during, and after the debate. All of those times are very important. Questions? That is all I have to say about the crossfire for now. So about questions about anything I said during this speech. How long can we keep the evidence cards? You mean, so when you ask for your opponent's evidence, when do you have to give the evidence back? Is that what you mean? So usually until the end of the debate, which is why we recommend that when you print out evidence cards, you always print out 2 copies, one for you and one to give your opponent if they ask to see it. Depending on the tournament, you might actually be allowed to keep the evidence cards digitally. So keep them in Google Drive or keep them on a Word document. If the debates are online, this is how evidence cards will work. And in that case, once you share the evidence cards, the opponents have the access to the evidence for good, and then the evidence stays there forever. So yeah, it depends on the format, but if it's physical evidence, you have to give it back at the end of the debate. Emily asks, are debaters allowed to ask the judge questions during prep time or only after the whole debate? Oh, good question. I was not clear about that. No, you're right. You're not allowed to talk to the judges during the debate. You should not ask you should not ask judges for advice during the round. You want to ask the judges for advice after they've already voted. So if they voted against you, you can ask them for advice about how to do things in the future. But no, yeah, during the debate, you should not ask your judges questions about the debate. Sorry if that was ambiguous. Yeah, no, absolutely. Other questions?
Yeah, there's one that came in. So can we ask the judge about how to answer questions after the crossfire? And what I said is,
oh, sorry,
that was you, Sean. You, Sean, asked that one. It was right after Emily's.
I thought you were asking the same question. Like, can we ask judges about the crossfire right after the crossfire ends? And the answer is no. You should not talk to the judges like right after the crossfire ends. What you should do is you should wait until after the debate's over, and then absolutely you can ask them questions about how to answer questions from the crossfire.
Yeah. So if there's a question where you're like, I have no idea how to answer that, and you have a judge that you think is really smart and you want their input, you can always be like, hey, so my opponent asked blah, blah, blah. I don't know what to say. Do you have advice? And absolutely. I have students ask me that question quite a bit, and I will help them to the best of my ability. Oh, okay. Charlotte provided a really good clarification about evidence cards, and that at NTNU tournaments, the cards have to be returned to the opponents by the end of prep time following a crossfire. So keep that in mind, that is NTNU standard. But like at NSDA, the National Speech and Debate Association for the United States, and United States style debates, the evidence card expectation differs on how long you can keep a physical piece and how long you can keep a digital piece. So
yeah, for tournaments, I think for Fulbright tournaments, we're actually going to probably stay digital. I think we're going to encourage you to share the evidence cards digitally if you can, just because that's much easier. Then you don't have to worry about losing the piece of paper. You don't have to worry about, handing the piece of paper back. So for tournaments we'll probably have a digital option, and that we would recommend for people. And in those cases, we would just have probably an email chain that includes all the students and the judges. And if someone asks for evidence, you would just send your evidence to that email chain so everybody can see it at the same time. Yeah, that's one where the specific rules will depend on the tournament, and you should make sure to check the tournament invitation and the tournament rules for that requirement.
I can get there's a website I want to share with you all real quickly. And actually, yeah, so I just got a good question in private chat that said, debaters have digital evidence? What is it like? How do they send it to each other? I'm going to share my screen because, so as Anthony said, sometimes, and I know this is very common in policy, NDT, and CETA style policy debate, to do email chains that will have everyone's email, and then people will send files back and forth. For the style, what's common in my world of debate I actually learned about this a couple of years ago from some high school students that I was working with, actually. It is a website called speechdrop.net, free to use. So you make a room, so it doesn't matter what you call it. So just sample room for FSE, whatever, you can call it whatever you want, doesn't matter. You hit make a room or make room. Then it will generate a unique code that you share with whoever's in the debate round. So when we're in person, the students, if they create it, they will generally write the speech drop code on the on the board, or they will read it very slowly for everyone. Then what is really cool about this, oh crud. Well, okay, 1 second, because I
Uh-oh. I think we lost Shana, but hopefully she'll come back. Oh, there we go.
yeah, try to run more than just Zoom on my computer and it freezes out. Let's see, stop sharing from that one. Hello, computer. Okay, so then what's really nice about this website is you can just, where it says drag files here or click to upload. So like with Google Drive or Dropbox or anything like that, where you can take a file from your computer and put it onto your cloud, it works the exact same way. So you can click here, pick whatever file you want. So for example, I'll go ahead and I'll just put this one in here. And then it's available for everyone. So if you wanted to try this, you could go to speechdrop.net, enter this code in, and you should be able to view and download this document. And so whoever has the code can upload the document super fast. It's very easy. The reason I use this over email chains is to avoid the problem of someone's email getting spelled wrong at the first, or the problem of someone doesn't hit reply all, like all that stuff doesn't matter. It just automatically puts it up there. And it's super easy for, if you have the audience in the type of debate I do, they will also like to read along evidence as the speeches are happening. And so they can do that as well. So this is an awesome website that we use to share electronic evidence so that we don't have to print.
The argument I would make for using email instead of speech drop is that you can keep it forever. So it is a trade-off.
If you write down the speech code or the room code, you can re-access it. I've gone back at least 2 months and been able to re-access a speech drop.
Oh, wow, really? Two months is a lot. I guess that's probably enough for most people.
Yeah.
I try, so I have a special email account that I use just for debate stuff because I want to both hold on to evidence that is read in debates I participate in, but I also try to do scouting to try to gather a bunch of information. So this email has almost 4,000 conversations in it between all my debates and all my scouting, and that is a lot of speech drop codes. So that so yeah, I guess there's a bit of a trade-off. It's a little bit easier to hold on to it if it's in your email, but speech drop is very convenient, so that's kind of, you can do either way.
It does. Yeah, there's not a right way or a wrong way. It's whatever you prefer. My circuit just likes speech drop because for whatever reason, a lot of us forget to hit the reply all button. And then we're sitting there going, I didn't get the email. And we, it takes so much more time. So we use speech drop. Mostly because I made people in my debates use speech drop, and then everyone else started following suit because I refused to do email chains. Okay. So in American style, in US debate, almost all tournaments now are the debaters debate off of a laptop or I would not debate off of a phone, but they will debate on a laptop or a tablet. I highly recommend laptops. They're the easiest to kind of move evidence around. And and we'll go over this in the research, and there's also a video. It's not about COVID, actually. We've been electronically debating since
2004. Women College started doing this in 2004.
Okay, I was gonna say, I know my Illinois State University went completely digital in 2014. We were kind of doing both prior to that, depending on what the student wanted to do. But in our styles of debate that Anthony and I both do primarily, we have one resolution for an entire school year. And so when you're printing off paper all the time and new files and new arguments, you could get, and when I say tubs, I mean those big plastic tubs that come with lids and everything. You could have 7, 8 of those depending on the topic, and then you would have to lug those everywhere. And we will fly to tournaments in the United States sometimes, and so then you have to ship all of that on the plane. It got really expensive and really annoying. The tubs would break and then your files would go everywhere. Yes, that happened to me in high school. Going up and down a set of stairs, my tubs, just the bottom went out and all my files ended up in a gazillion different places. And so it just became a norm to start debating and reading off of our laptops and off of our computers. And you can even see that in a lot of videos online that are more current. You'll see the students debating off of their computer screens and reading off of that instead of reading off of physical paper. It's what we do. It's what works for us. Paper is absolutely fine, especially in PF where there's not as many files that you have to keep. Usually you can have 1 or 2 of those, I call them accordion files, or the expanding folders that have pockets in them. Yeah. So actually here, okay, I'm going to show you my table. My table is a mess. Don't judge me, but I'll show you what I'm using right now. So I have, you can kind of see it, I guess, that which holds my laptop up. And so I would put that on you can put that on a podium. They also sell ones that the height of them can be adjusted, so how tall they stand. And they'll use those as a podium instead of using the given podium. And that's completely normal for us anymore. And it saves also a lot of money because we're not having to pay for all the ink and all the paper. It's cheaper in the long run to buy laptops. Yeah, there we go. Thank you. Table tote. That I couldn't think of the word, Anthony. Thank you. It was like the thing that holds the thing that brings the thing with them. And there's a lot of different table totes you can use.
But we do just want to make clear that it is totally fine to use laptops. However, if you don't, we're definitely not saying that in order to do public forum you need to buy a laptop. Like if you don't have a laptop, I mean, I personally find it easier to debate with a laptop, and you may also find it easier. But if you don't want to spend the money, you absolutely do not need to go do it. You can make do with paper. You can make do with a tablet if you've got a tablet, or a Chromebook, you can do it with Google Docs. None of that is quite as good as using a laptop, but it's totally serviceable. So don't feel like we're telling you like go spend money or anything. And don't go telling your parents that like we ordered you to go buy a laptop or something. Yeah, it's totally okay to just use whatever you have.
My entire high school career was paper, and the majority of my college career was paper. So laptop is not necessary at all. It's just the norm in the United States, I guess is what we would say. And then also, and we'll go over this, but there is a website called paperlessdebate.com that you can use. And if you go there, there's a program called Verbatim. And there's videos and all of that you can use to teach you how to debate online or on your computer. So the debaters can use internet to search for info during an argument or crossfire. That depends on the rules for the organization that is hosting the tournament. Some organizations have a very hard, absolutely not. The only thing you can access the internet for is to go to Dropbox to open a file or something like that. You cannot do extra research. Some, come to find out, my organization does not have a rule against it. So if you wanted to go and do research, you can. I mean, you only get 4 minutes in a round. So it'll depend on how fast you can find the research and make a card and, be able to use it, but it's allowed. So it just depends upon the organization's rules. So you'd have to know those. So being allowed to use laptops during a debate and exchange sounds more environmentally friendly and probably easier to organize and find the piece of evidence you want. In my opinion, and I'm going to take a wild guess that Anthony will agree, yes. Because you can use the find function in your folders. You can organize it, as detailed as you want. Personally, that's why I like debating on my computer.
I mean, I'm going to give you a sneak preview here. Sorry, I was going to say, I'm going to give you a sneak preview here of what the evidence packet we're going to give you all later today is. And actually, do they already have access to it through the Google Drive?
No, but I can put it in there.
Maybe.
That's actually a good point. I'll put it into the Google Drive right now.
Yeah, well, whatever. We'll give you access to this packet of evidence, and I made this online, and as you can see, so one thing is it's 74 pages, so that would be quite annoying to print out and carry around 2 copies of. For another thing, as you can tell, there is quite a lot. So the fact that I have this really nice navigation pane that lets me click around to go wherever I want, that's very convenient. And like Shanna said, I can scroll and I can use the find function to see what I'm looking for. This might look intimidating right now. Don't worry, we will demystify and explain what's going on here later on. That's what this afternoon is for. But yeah, I'm just giving you this preview for now to say that I would agree that laptops are easier. If the tournament allows you to use the internet to look things up, which like Shanna said, it depends on the tournament, it is usually okay for anyone who is not actively talking to look things up. So that can be during your speech, it could be during your opponent's speech, it could be during a crossfire, or it could be during prep time. The one thing I will say is, again, during those speeches, flowing is really important. And during a crossfire, it is always helpful since there's teamwork to be paying attention to the exchange. So you can kind of help out your teammates if they need help. So there is a downside to doing that during speeches or crossfires, but you are allowed to do it. I would not recommend that the teammate who is talking do it, just because that seems rough. Like that's some impressive multitasking that I don't think I would be able to do. So I'm suggesting that you don't try to do that either. And yes, Shannon makes a good point. If the one thing that's definitely banned all the time everywhere is coaches cannot communicate with their teams during the round. Once the round starts, it's only up to what the students have in the room with them. You cannot talk to your coach, whether that's to send suggestions or to send research or anything like that. Absolutely not allowed. That's the kind of thing where, like, if I was like in a tournament that I'm in charge of, if you get caught doing that with proof, your school is out of the tournament. Like that's like a really bad, you really don't want to do that.
Yeah, your entire school. So if you have, and in the US, you can have one school can have 4, 5, 6+ entries. And if only one entry does it, the entire school is disqualified. So you're punishing, your entire squad gets punished. But it's not just coaches. You cannot have a teammate, that if you're in like finals, and so your entire school is watching you, your teammates cannot send you information either. You cannot speak to anyone that is not your partner for help during the actual debate. Now, before the debate starts, get all the help you want, talk to your coaches, talk to your teammates, but during the actual debate, nope. Other questions? These are great questions about, different things to use and different ways to approach debate.
I got a question in a private chat, which is how do people know if that rule is broken? Because it's hard to tell from looking over someone's shoulder on the computer. A big part of it is trust. Like there are a lot of rules that would, are theoretically possible to break. And if you think about it, right, we did the last set of tournaments for NTNU non-policy debate online over Cisco. And it would have theoretically been possible for the teams to have a coach standing in the room, giving them pointers, telling them what to say, right? And we trust that people have good sportsmanship and people understand that, if you won because your coach wrote all your speeches for you, that's not particularly satisfying. It doesn't feel very good. It defeats the whole point of what we're doing here. So a big part of it is trust. We want to believe that you all are going to try to win honestly. You're going to be fair competitors and you're going to be respectful to the work that all of your classmates and all of your competitors and all of your teachers are putting in on your behalf. But it is also pretty easy to see a lot of the time. Like if you are on a chatting service, if someone walks behind you and sees a chat window open with a coach, that's something that's pretty easy to look at and to see kind of incidentally as you're doing it. So if a lot of times people can do this and not get caught, but if you do it a lot, you almost certainly will get caught eventually. And even if you don't get caught, you will feel like a terrible person. So don't do it. What are the limits for tomorrow? Tomorrow, we're not doing a real competition. So a lot of this is much more flexible. If you are lost in the middle of the debate and you just have no idea what's going on, asking someone else for help, like, oh, what speech is supposed to come next? Or what am I supposed to do now? Is totally fine because we're practicing. But that's only because we're practicing. This is not like a competition. So do not worry about much of the stuff tomorrow. But at the tournaments, make sure you follow the tournament rules. Judges can do whatever they want.
I do not recommend during the debate that you research. I encourage my judges to evaluate what happens in the round. What do the actual debaters say? The only time that I personally will do any research is if there is a fact or something that is said in the round where it makes me go, is that true? That doesn't sound true. Wait a minute. you know, and then I will go be like, you know, I'll go research that thing super quickly to do a very, very quick fact check. And if it's wrong, I'm like, y'all are lying, or the information you're using is real bad. But I do not recommend, because then it's really easy to get caught up in doing the research and they'll start debating and you'll miss something and it becomes a whole mess. So I do not encourage judges researching unless it's something that you really feel needs to be fact checked.
Yeah, no, Shanna's right. When I said judges can do whatever they want, I just meant in the sense of like, you're an adult, no one can tell you what to do. But like, yes, you should vote on what the debaters say. You should not be trying to like just research and try to prove the debaters wrong the whole time as you're listening, for sure.
I have had judges that have done that, and I was like, dude, what? And they're like, well, you didn't make this argument and this argument and this argument. And I was like, man, I don't have unlimited time to make all those arguments. So, but you know, you win some, you lose some. That's all that matters. Have fun. Don't take it too seriously. Other questions before we take a really short break and then move into the breakout session?
Judges should only vote on arguments that are made by the debaters. So if a judge does their own research, so even in the example Shanna was giving, where she hears a fact and she's like, I don't know if that sounds right, so she checks it. If I were to do that, and if Shanna were to do that, the reason would be because we're curious and we want to say something to the debaters after the round, like, hey, this is wrong, you shouldn't say this, or because we didn't follow, so we want to get some background to get a better understanding of what's happening in the debate. But if I did research, I looked up a fact and I was like, this is completely wrong, I would not just dismiss the argument because I think it's wrong. I would vote on whatever the other team says about that argument. And then after the debate, I would say, hey, just so you know, I Googled this during, you know, while the debate was happening, and I think this doesn't seem right. So you should keep that in mind in the future.
I will give a small qualifier to that, to go back to Toolman. There are very few times where I will vote against a team if they give me blatantly incorrect information in an attempt to trick their opponents purposefully and to win the debate. Because I do not believe that, you know, lying and tricking is debate. And I will punish a team for blatant, false, incorrect information. Or if a team reads evidence out of context, I will punish the team that reads evidence out of context. And the reason I say this is because one year at a national tournament I was judging for my style of debate, there was a team, and the first time I read the piece of evidence and noticed it was out of context, I told the team, I was like, hey, just so you know, I read the entire article. You are taking this out of context. You need to stop making this argument as a team. And gave them a heads up of, hey, if I see this again, I will be punishing you as a team. And we got all the way to semifinals. Mind you, this was a tournament with almost 100 debaters at it. And that team read that piece of evidence again and used it as their main argument they went for. And I voted against them because I'd given them a warning. I actually, I think, gave them 2 or 3 warnings as a squad. And by semifinals, I was just done. And I voted against them and I told, you know, called them out in front of quite a large crowd that was watching it. But that's really rare that will happen. very rare. And like Anthony says, like I will always give warnings unless it's absolutely like if someone tried to tell me the Holocaust didn't happen, I would be like, no, you're absolutely wrong. And no. So
normal academic rules apply as well. So if you're plagiarizing, if you are lying about what your evidence says, if you are, it's obvious that you're doing this on purpose. Just like you would react to a paper by giving someone a failing grade if they plagiarize or if they, commit some ethical violation. Same thing applies here. If someone is being unethical, you can definitely vote against them.
Yes,
Charlotte,
only after the round. Yeah, that's when I warned them, after the round.
Charlotte asks, you've seen some debaters refuse to answer questions by saying, I don't see the relevancy of your question to this debate, and just didn't respond to the question. If I was the one asking the question and I got a response like that, I would say something like, I promise it's relevant, just humor me or something. Or just, and if the debater still refuses to answer that question, I'm sure when you witnessed that exchange, you probably thought the person answering looked pretty silly. And that is kind of, it's like, yeah, that person looks pretty bad in that situation, especially if they're wrong.
I always laugh because that is generally debater code for, I don't have an answer and I really hope you don't talk about this in your speech. That's right. They're like, oh, I don't see the relevance of this. It doesn't matter. Blah, blah, blah is usually like, please, whatever you do, don't make this argument because I don't have an answer and I will lose. And so I will giggle in the back of a round. So
yeah,
if I ever judge you, that's why I'm giggling.
The one exception is, of course, if the debater has a good reason for why they think the question isn't relevant and they explain their reason.
Yeah.
Like if there's an actually irrelevant question and I'm answering, I might say something like, I think you're asking this because you think my argument is this. And our argument is not this. Our argument is different from what you're asking about because of ABC. And for that reason, I don't think your question is relevant. That's a much more,
yes.
Again, the key is it's less about what specifically you say. It's about showing that you know what you're talking about. So if Charlotte's watching a debate, we want to convince Charlotte that we're not being obnoxious. And clearly, just asserting that the question isn't relevant is not something that is very good at convincing Charlotte that we are smart and know what we're doing. Whereas if we give a specific explanation, then it might be. The key is just we have to project confidence and competence when we answer stuff.
All right, it is 11:09, and so that we can ensure that we get in the last two sessions before lunch at 12:30, let's take a 5-minute break to stretch, use the toilet, get something to drink or snack on. So be back at 11:15.